Part 3, Electromagnetic Pollution. Chapter 7, The Natural Electromagnetic Field. More problematic is the claim that evolutionary change is driven by random mutations, to place pure chance at the center of the awesome edifice of biology is for many scientists too much to swallow. Even Darwin himself expressed misgivings. Paul Davies, The Cosmic Blueprint. As noted earlier, pre-literate peoples around the world viewed the environment as being filled with mysterious forces that govern their lives. We regard such superstition with amusement because we know there are no such things. Over the past 500 years, science has given us more and more power to control our lives and destinies. However, researchers now tell us that the complex environment in which we live does indeed contain immense unseen forces, the forces of electromagnetism that do affect living things. This knowledge has come to light only during the past 30 years as we have acquired the capability of exploring and conducting experiments in space. In earlier chapters, I referred to the cycles of change in natural magnetic field of the Earth. In this chapter, I will indicate the complexity of these unseen forces and will show how they have played an important role in the origin and evolution of life, and how they still regulate our everyday lives, including our health and well-being. The Earth's geomagnetic field. The spinning core of molten iron miles beneath the surface of the Earth creates a dipole magnetic field, much like a bar magnet. However, the energy of the sun distorts and perturbs this simple field into a unique structure, the magnetosphere. The sun constantly gives off a solar wind composed of high-energy atomic particles. These particles travel through space at great speed and crash into the outer layers of the Earth's magnetic field, compressing it until its energy matches that of the solar wind. The area of interaction between these two forces is called a bow-shock region. On the side away from the sun, the magnetic field is drawn out into a long magnetotail, which stretches away from the Earth far into space. The Van Allen belts are two areas in this interacting field in which some of the high-energy particles are trapped. These particles constantly spiral between the north and south ends of the magnetic ducts in which they are trapped, bouncing back and forth. In addition to the solar wind particles, the sun gives off enormous amounts of deadly ionizing radiation and other high-energy radiation. The magnetosphere shields the Earth from these rays by absorbing or diverting them around the Earth. Without this protection, life could not exist on Earth, and as it cannot exist for long in the environment outside of the magnetosphere. Space flights beyond its boundaries must be of short duration and must be timed to occur during periods of quiet solar cycle. Astronauts outside the magnetosphere would perish if caught in a solar storm. Thanks to the magnetosphere, we live on a small protected island in a hostile universe filled with enormous forces. The Earth rotates on a day-night cycle within this complex field. The magnetosphere does not rotate but remains fixed in space, with one side always facing the sun. Because of this, any given spot on the surface of the Earth is in a constantly changing magnetic field. The daily rise and fall in the strength of this field causes biological rhythms. This interaction between the energy in the solar wind and the energy in the magnetic field of the Earth results in the generation of enormous electrical currents with powers of billions of watts. It also results in production of ionizing radiation and various electromagnetic waves in the extra low frequency, ELF range, between 0 and 100 cycles per second, and in very low frequency, VLF range, between 100 and 1,000 cycles per second. This is a quiet field with a steady flow of solar wind from an inactive sun. Magnetic storms and human behavior. The sun is not constant in its activity, rather it shows the cycle of activity in its energy output that rises and falls on the 11-year sunspot cycle. During periods of high activity, solar storms are common. These are different from magnetic storms in that they are a result of gigantic eruptions of energy on the surface of the sun, solar flares. Solar flares produce marked increase in the number of energetic particles in the solar wind and in the production of X-rays. streams of protons and radio waves which impinge on the magnetosphere and cause great magnetic field disturbances called magnetic storms. During a magnetic storm, the strength of the geomagnetic field fluctuates wildly and increases greatly in strength. This disturbance in the surface magnetic field is often strong enough to cause very high power currents to flow in electric transmission and telephone lines, causing their breakdown. Similar events simultaneously occur in the ionosphere and produce major disturbances in radio and television signals. Many of us have been fortunate enough to see the northern lights or aurora borealis. These beautiful flickering beams and curtains of varicolored lights in the sky are caused by solar storms. The high energy particles of the solar wind enter the magnetic field envelope at the polar region and penetrate down into the upper layers of the atmosphere, where they interact with gas molecules to produce the lights. If the quiet magnetic field with its minor daily fluctuations in strength is sensed by living things, it would appear that magnetic storms should have dramatic biological effects. Long before we had any knowledge of the interaction between living things and magnetic fields, many scientists claimed that such magnetic storms were associated with human and animal behavioral disturbances. These ideas were always dismissed as nonsense because there was no known physical way that any interaction could take place. The complexities of the magnetosphere began to be better understood in the early 1960s, primarily as a result of global research done during the International Geophysical Year, 1957 to 58. I had been a volunteer aurora observer during that time and had received the new data on the magnetic field measurements and relationships. By 1962, my laboratory research had led me to postulate that there really could be some relationship between the geomagnetic field and human biology, particularly in the area of behavior. In Chapter 4, I described how Dr. Howard Friedman and I decided to take another look at the possibility of a relationship between magnetic storms and human behavior. In 1963, we reported that admission to mental hospitals increased significantly during any week in which a major magnetic storm occurred. Later, we were able to relate the day-to-day behavior of psychiatric patients to lesser changes in the Earth's magnetic field. This raises the possibility that relationships between human beings and the geomagnetic field may not be limited to psychiatric patients. Such additional relationships will be discussed later. Research on the complexities of the magnetosphere is still going on. What I have presented, complex though it may appear, is only a simplified version of the whole picture, which is still emerging. Based on the consideration of the Earth's magnetic field environment, physicists have expanded the scope of their research to include the entire universe. Enormous electromagnetic fields and currents are now known to be present in space, interrelated in complex and unusual relationships. Through the work of Hans Alfvén, a theory that the formation of the universe resulted from such interactions, rather than from a Big Bang, has been gaining ground. This work is of a fundamental importance, and where it will lead is anyone's guess at this time. Magnetic reversals and species extinctions. We know now that the Earth's geomagnetic field has reversed itself many times in the past, with the North and South poles trading places. Humanity has never been through such a magnetic reversal, but other species have, with dire results. The way in which we learned about this is a fascinating scientific detective story. The tiny dust particles that enter the oceans carried by winds or rivers are deposited on the ocean floor as sort of a layer cake of the time. This chronological record is studied by dropping hollow tubes into the ocean bottom and removing cores of the sediment. Many of the particles in the cores are magnetic and have tiny magnetic fields. As they are sedimenting through the water, each particle acts like a compass needle and points towards the magnetic North Pole. The alignment of these particles in the cores can be determined by measuring the direction of their magnetic fields, which will indicate the direction of the magnetic North Pole at the time the particles were falling through the water. When this is done, the startling fact emerges that the Earth's magnetic field has often reversed itself in the geologic past. Each reversal is a slow process. In each case, it has taken at least 10,000 years for the new orientation to become established. The same cores of sea bottom sediment also contain vast numbers of skeletons of minute sea creatures, the Radiolarians. These are single-celled animals that produce hard skeletons around their bodies. The skeletons are complicated structures different for each species, and these animals die. Their skeletons sink to the bottom and become incorporated into the sediment of that era. A chronology of the changes in the species of these animals is thereby established. Examination reveals that from time to time, these animals were subjected to mass species extinctions. These great die-outs duplicated the familiar pattern of extinction of other animals, including the dinosaurs. In each such species collapse, the most advanced or evolutionary developed forms appear to have been the most affected. After each extinction, entirely new types of radiolarians would be established and would grow and flourish, generating many related but more advanced species. This finding seemed to run counter to our idea of evolution as a steady upward climb, with new forms of ever-increasing complexity arising from simpler forms. However, in 1967, Dr. Homer Newell of New York Museum of Natural History reviewed the data on the population size of many different animals and found that there were several periods of time during which many different species had become extinct. These occurred at the end of the Devonian, Permian, Triassic, and Cretaceous geologic periods. It was during the last one that the dinosaurs became extinct. This description of periods of crisis in life had slowly led to a revision of the original Darwinian concept of gradual evolution, replacing it with what we now call punctuated equilibrium. According to this theory, each period of extinction appears to mark or produce a change in the direction of evolution. After the extinction has wiped the slate clean, new forms appear that mark the new pathway of evolution. This raises the question of the causes of the past extinctions. Over the years, the study of sea bottom cores, a strange relationship was seen to emerge. Often, the species extinction seemed to occur just after a magnetic field reversal had taken place. Furthermore, if the reversal occurred following an exceptionally long period of stable field, the species extinction was much more extensive. It appeared as though the life forms of the quiescent time adapted themselves to the magnetic field. The longer it went on, the greater the impact of the next reversal. The problem for investigators was how a simple change in the magnetic field, particularly one that took tens of thousands of years to occur, could have any biological effect. At first, researchers proposed that while the magnetic poles were changing places, the Earth's field would drop to zero, causing the magnetosphere to collapse and expose the Earth's surface to the full force of the solar wind and ionizing radiation. The resultant exposure to the full radiation from the sun would kill all organisms. Later, it was found that the field did not actually drop to zero, but merely declined to about half strength before building back up again. If the magnetic reversals were directly linked to species extinctions, another mechanism had to be operating. In 1971, a small conference was held on the subject at the Lamont Geophysical Observatory at Columbia University under the direction of Dr. James Hayes. After collecting data on reversals and extinctions, Dr. Hayes had found that 6 of 8 identified extinctions of radiolarians had occurred concurrent with magnetic field reversals, a relationship considerably above the level of chance. It became evident during the conference that species extinction of all animals were somehow linked to the reversals of the magnetic field. Although the theory that extinctions are the result of impacts on Earth or comets or asteroids is much in favor at this time, there is clearly an intriguing relationship between the reversals of the Earth's magnetic field and these events. It is, of course, possible that the magnetic reversal was itself the result of an impact upon Earth, but this seems to be too complex a chain of events to consider. Instead, the question hinges on the idea that a reversal of the magnetic field could alone be competent cause for subsequent species extinction. At the Lamont conference, I proposed that reversals could have been accompanied by major changes in the ELF frequencies of the magnetic field micropulsations, which could have produced behavioral changes that reduced the survival efficiency of more advanced species. More recently, Dr. Abraham Liboff of Oakland University has proposed that these frequency alterations could have influenced reproduction and produced defective offspring. At this time, there is increasing evidence that both of these theories may be valid. They offer one advantage over the cometary impact theory, that the effects would have been selective, affecting only the more advanced or most sensitive species, and most likely only animals. Cometary impact would require that there was an effect upon all living things, including plants, but the fossil evidence seemed to indicate that plants were not significantly involved. Present evidence from studies on the bioeffects of abnormal electromagnetic fields indicates that such long-term alterations in the frequency spectrum of the micropulsations could have major deleterious effects. Whatever the mechanism, it appears that the evolution is not simply a random event, but it is in part driven by changes in the Earth's natural magnetic field, as well as by the abnormal fields resulting from our use of electromagnetic energy for power and communication. All of this may lead you to wonder when the next reversal is due and what effect it will have on the human race. Our history has been limited to what amounts to the blink of an eye in geological time. We expanded, developed our civilizations, and acquired our scientific knowledge within the past 25,000 years in a time of unique freedom from great geological disturbances. We should not assume that this happy situation will continue. The evidence is that we are in the initial stages of reversal. The average strength of the natural magnetic field has been gradually declining for past several decades. The micropulsation frequencies are not routinely measured or evaluated, but it appears that no changes have yet taken place. The 11-year solar cycle is now approaching a peak, and all indices show that this cycle is stronger and more disturbed than any that has previously been measured. However, the problem may very well be academic. We may have unwittingly produced the equivalent of the greatest reversal ever through our global use of electromagnetic energy. A natural magnetic reversal takes thousands of years to occur. It appears likely that the biological effects of reversals are due to changes in the frequency spectrum of the micropulsations, and we have produced far more than the equivalent change in frequencies in the last 50 years alone. The effects of this change upon human health have already been identified, and they are subjects of Chapter 8 and 11.